And so while critical social theory doesn't have to operate as a worldview, it doesn't have to, it's pushing to do that, and then it often does.
When I'm thinking about, in particular, how these things have made their way into the church, one of the things I would love to help our viewers and our listeners understand with today's podcast is why you can't just take one aspect and keep it there. When we're talking about critical theory, you can't only apply that to race. You can't only apply that to one thing or another. It's really all interconnected, and I would really love to help our audience understand that, because I think back when the George Floyd incident happened, Christians were like, we don't want to be racist, right? We want to do justice. We want there to be justice in our society. And I think that for a lot of well-meaning Christians, they might have embraced some of the categories of critical race theory unintentionally, not realizing that even if you tried to apply critical race theory only to race, it just doesn't work that way. So maybe you can help us understand that. Neil, why can't we just apply that to one area like race?
Excellent question. The single word answer is intersectionality. This idea actually goes back prior to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term. You could argue that it comes from like the 60s and 70s, the Black feminists, the womanists like Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde. But the idea is that all of these oppressions, racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, they all are interlocking and inextricable. And you can't separate out racism and sexism and say, well, this is active and not this. No, they are overlapping. And that was Kimberly Crenshaw's main contribution to this idea of intersectionality in the 1989 and 1991 papers that she wrote. And today, I would argue that this intersectional framework has really fused all these different schools of thoughts. This is why if you read a textbook on critical race theory, it will bring up queer theory. It'll bring up post-colonialism. If you read a book on queer theory, it'll bring up critical race theory. And so you see it in the theorists themselves. And in fact, and there's a 1993 anthology called Words That Wound, which was co-authored by Crenshaw and a number of other leading critical race theorists who are all legal scholars. And in that text, 1993, they list one of the defining elements of critical race theory as recognizing these interlocking systems of oppression, racism, classism, heterosexism, and so on. And they said that critical race theory, keep in mind, works towards the abolition of all social hierarchies and hierarchy itself. So when people naively say, well, this is just a legal field or it just applies to race, the answer is if you read the actual theorist going back 30 years and more, they will say no. You have to understand these are all intersectionally related oppressions. You cannot dismantle one unless you dismantle all of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pat,
could
please
I mention a couple
jump
things?
in.
Neil is absolutely correct, certainly. And we would also mention that what complicates this, Alisa, is the fact that there are aspects of critical social theory that are true, that are correct, that are right. And we talk about this in our book.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is possible when you're thinking about critical race theory, for instance, there's certain things that critical race theory would claim, like, for instance, race is a social construct, that is in fact true. Mm-hmm. And so one could embrace that truth as part of critical race theory, but then not necessarily onboard all the other ideas associated with critical race theory that might be problematic. And so we want to acknowledge that dynamic. With that said, though, two things. One, as Neil referenced, the scholarship itself disallows someone to pick their spots, so to speak. And in fact, there's peer-reviewed scholarship that states very plainly that you can't bifurcate these ideas. You can't just unravel the rope into its individual strands. No, if you're going to be truly against racism, then you have to be truly against homophobia, as that's being defined by critical social theory, and that you can't do one without the other. And so we want to do several things at once. Acknowledge that there are things that are true, for instance, about critical race theory, But then when we're talking about interlocking systems of oppression, that if you embrace critical race theory totally, then you're going to be running afoul and being problematic in terms of the Christian faith. Well, we're not just making that up. The scholarship itself says this, and we quote the scholarship extensively. The scholarship itself wants everyone to disabuse themselves of this notion that you can just take part of what critical race theory is saying and then reject the other, and then that's an acceptable position as far as critical social theory is concerned. Now, again, we understand that individuals can do that. And then the next thing I would say is that critical social theory itself wants to colonize the mind more and more and more. It wants to increase its jurisdiction over how you think. And so, since its push is in that direction, now we're susceptible of people not just picking their spots, even though that's still disallowed by the scholarship, but even if they're doing that on an individual level, the attempt to do that will be against the pressure of the knowledge area trying to take more and more jurisdiction of how you think. And so while critical social theory doesn't have to operate as a worldview, it doesn't have to, it's pushing to do that. And then it often does. It often does, because then once you see certain ground, then there's other ground that you're going to be tempted to give up as well. And again, we're not superstitious. We know that this can be done in terms of parsing some things out, but this goes against the thrust of the knowledge area. And then on top of that, as you and as we all know, there's supernatural forces at work at times as we're dealing with ideas. We're commanded, 2 Corinthians 10:5, to take every thought captive for a reason. And so this is where the difficulty comes, because we want to parse it out correctly and identify the knowledge area correctly. But we also don't want to act as if that there is not a strong push here to move these ideas into meta-narrative and worldview perspective.
Absolutely.
And then when you do that, you've got to take everything wholesale, and now you're in a world of trouble in terms of Christian epistemology.